While everyone focuses on the confrontation between the United States, China, and Russia, a historical European power is silently building their independent path of geopolitics. Pedro Sanchez's Spain is no longer the same country we once knew. And what's happening in Madrid could completely change our understanding of how 21st century geopolitics works. There's a completely wrong conception of analyzing world geopolitics in monolithic blocks. This wasn't true even during the Cold War, and it's even less true today. Current world looks much more like the 18th and 19th century Great Game between European powers than that simplistic East-West division we've studied in history books. Countries like Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Hungary have their own geostrategic objectives. They submit to NATO projects as a whole only to project power, but they maintain completely independent strategic agendas from the Atlantic hardcore formed by the United Kingdom, France, and the United States. And Spain has always been this way. To understand what's happening today, we need to look back. Spain has always had a more conscious and pragmatic deep state that never allowed itself to be completely carried away by ideological rhetoric. A glaring example is about Francisco Franco, that controversial, conservative, Catholic, an autocratic figure who persecuted minorities in Spain, was paradoxically a great supporter of revolutionary Cuba's regime. When Franco died in 1975, Cuba decreed 3 days of national mourning. This information is systematically forgotten by analysts, but it reveals something fundamental about the Spanish elite. Franco put Spain in NATO, yes, but maintained his own geostrategic thinking. This pragmatic mentality built during Francoism survived democratization and continues to influence Madrid's decisions to this day. The same pattern can be seen in Italy, where one of the central reasons for Operation Clean Hands and Berlusconi's downfall were precisely his relations with Gaddafi's Libya, which contradicted French interests in the region. This shows us that trying to divide the world into an imperialist bloc versus an anti-imperialist bloc simply doesn't work. The name of the game is pure geopolitics, not idealism from either side. And it's with this realistic vision that we need to analyze what Spain is currently doing. Since the beginning of Russia's military operation in Ukraine in 2022, Spain has adopted a completely different stance from most of its European partners. Madrid sold weapons to the Ukrainians, complied with European Union sanctions, but never fully embarked on the wave of trying to destroy its own economy to save the Anglo-Franco-American project in Ukraine. The first major milestone of this new stance came with the issue of military spending. When U.S. President and other NATO leaders pressed for an increase in defense spending to 5% of GDP, Spain simply said no. Pedro Sánchez secured an official exception from this target, maintaining Spain's commitment at 2.1% of GDP. The Spanish Prime Minister publicly declared that the 5% target was not only unreasonable, but also counterproductive. This decision wasn't just about money. It was a geopolitical declaration. Spain made it clear that it wasn't willing to give up its investments in civil industry, social welfare, and its own national project to strengthen the Atlantic military-industrial complex. It was a signal to other European countries that there's an alternative to total submission to Washington's dictates, and it wasn't just Spain. Giorgia Meloni's Italy adopted exactly the same stance. Both countries refused to participate in the massive increase in military aid to Ukraine proposed by the United States and France. This happens because there's a geopolitical dispute within Europe itself. All Mediterranean countries, except Greece, compete for the same geostrategic space with France. Turkey, Spain, Italy, and Portugal know that as long as France is one of the dominant powers within the European Union logic, they won't be able to expand their geopolitical influence and broaden their spheres of interest. That's why they adopt a more pragmatic line that frequently clashes with the French project. Since the Ukraine project is fundamentally an Anglo-Franco-American project, nothing could be more natural than Spain and Italy not fully embarking on this wave. But what really changed the game was a discovery that went almost unnoticed. By international media, Spanish companies are providing machinery for Russia to produce weapons and artillery. In other words, while the Spanish state officially supports sanctions against Moscow, the Spanish deep state, through its business oligarchy, is in practice helping Russia wage war against Ukraine. This shows that Madrid isn't really willing to keep betting on the Ukrainian project, and this stance has been consolidating since 2024. Spain's great strategic turn becomes evident when we analyze its New Africa Strategy 2025 to 2028. In December 2024, Pedro Sánchez officially presented a plan with 5 clear objectives and 100 specific lines of action to completely redefine Spanish relations with the African continent. This isn't just an economic strategy, it's a geopolitical declaration of war against French hegemony in Africa. The game in North Africa is particularly fascinating. Spain has always maintained excellent relations with Morocco, including military and defense cooperation. But at the same time, Madrid is rapidly approaching Algeria, Morocco's great regional rival. Spain has formed a strategic partnership with Algiers that goes far beyond cooperation against drug trafficking and terrorism. To understand the importance of this movement, we need to remember that there's a permanent dispute in Western Sahara between Algeria and Morocco. Morocco is supported by France, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Algeria is mainly supported by Russia. The issue is that Algeria has by far the best army in all of Africa. If it weren't for this balance of forces, the conflict would have already escalated to a much more dangerous level. Spain is entering this game to counterbalance French influence in the region, doing exactly what Italy is doing alongside Turkey and other African theaters. A retired Spanish admiral, Juan Rodriguez Gata, recently published a study calling the Moroccan regime a cowardly and dishonest system that only recognizes the language of power, stating that if Algeria and Spain had more power, they wouldn't hesitate to declare war on Morocco for its expansionist ambitions. When high-ranking former military officials make statements like this, it's rarely on their own. They're frequently being used to say what the government cannot officially say. This statement signals a fundamental change in Spanish stance toward the Maghreb. The rapper's man with Sudan is another perfect example of this new strategy. Spain condemned attacks on Sudanese civil infrastructure. But what's interesting is that it specifically condemned the Rapid Support Forces, which are backed by the United Arab Emirates, France, and the United States. This clearly indicates that Madrid is trying to approach the Burhan government in Khartoum. To confirm this thesis, in 2024, Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir visited Spain for a conference on finance, development, and infrastructure. But Spain isn't limiting its new strategy to Africa. Rapprochement with Vietnam is perhaps even more significant from a geopolitical standpoint. Bilateral trade between Madrid and Hanoi reached €4.57 billion in 2022, a 29% growth compared to the previous year. This is a historic record in relations between the two countries. Vietnam is a perfect case study of geopolitical pragmatism. Hanoi manages to maintain excellent relations with China, the United States, and Europe simultaneously, playing all powers against each other to maximize its own national interests. Spain is positioning itself as the European alternative to France and former Indochina. The cooperation focuses specifically on infrastructure development, metro systems, urban railways, and urban planning. This means Spain is directly competing with other European powers in Southeast Asia, a region that was traditionally outside the Spanish sphere of influence. Spanish expansion in Central Asia is even more surprising. Since 2018, Madrid has been strengthening relations with countries like Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan. Spanish police began training with Kyrgyz security forces, and the two countries are rapidly deepening economic ties. Turkmenistan, one of the world's most closed countries, is officially and publicly deepening economic relations with Spain. This isn't coincidence. Central Asia is extremely rich in rare earths, strategic minerals, natural gas, and oil. All these resources are at the center of 21st century geoeconomic competition. Furthermore, Central Asia is a giant crossroads between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. With the continued growth of Russia, Turkey, and Iran, this region could once again become the world's most important trade route, as it was during various periods of medieval and modern history. The question we still don't know is whether Spain will cooperate or compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative. Knowing Spanish pragmatism, I would bet Madrid will adopt the same model Turkey uses: non-competitive cooperation with Beijing, maximizing benefits for both sides without creating unnecessary friction. This Spanish strategy isn't happening in a vacuum. Giorgia Meloni's Italy is following a surprisingly similar pattern. Both countries resisted pressures to increase military spending, both have African policies independent of France, and both are seeking partnerships with middle powers like Turkey and Algeria. At the same time, Spain and Italy compete for the same geographical space in the Mediterranean. They cooperate in resisting Atlanticist pressures, but compete for North African energy markets and influence in the same region. For Brazil and Latin America, these Spanish movements open completely new opportunities. Spain is developing what it calls new generation partnerships with Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, and Uruguay. This is a South-South cooperation model that offers a real alternative to traditional partnerships with the United States and France. What we're seeing is a fragmentation of what we traditionally called the West. There's no longer a monolithic Western bloc. There are middle powers with their own agendas, seeking room for maneuver within and outside traditional power structures. Spain is demonstrating that it's possible to remain within NATO and the European Union while developing a completely independent foreign policy from Franco-American interests. This is a valuable lesson for any country seeking strategic autonomy in the 21st century. The implications are enormous. We're possibly seeing the birth of a new geopolitical axis: Spain, Italy, and Turkey in the Mediterranean, informally cooperating to counterbalance French hegemony in the region. If this alignment consolidates, it could completely change the balance of power in Europe and North Africa. The expansion of Spanish influence in Africa and Asia could also serve as a model for other European countries seeking greater autonomy. This could have significant impacts on the next European elections and the internal dynamics of the European Union. What Spain is doing is a return to the classic multipolar system, where each power seeks to maximize its own interests through flexible and pragmatic alliances. It's the end of the illusion that there's a unified West against the rest of the world. For countries in Global South, this represents a historic opportunity. The more Europe fragments into middle powers with their own agendas, the more space exists for innovative South-South partnerships that don't depend on approval from Washington or Paris. Spain is silently changing the rules of the global geopolitical game. The question now is, who else will follow this example? And don't forget, like the video and subscribe the channel to keep thunking the world how it really is.